Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's celebration of 75 years UN in Groningen, organized by SIP in the studio of Forum. My name is Peter van der Geer. I'm your moderator tonight, and we make it a very lively night because it's not just me asking the questions to the people that we have on the podium and in New York and London. No, it's also you in the audience who can ask questions. Welcome also people at home, because it's a very special celebration this year, and it's something that people will regard from a little distance, but I'm sure you will enjoy tonight. Imagine that your grandparents, your grandfather, grandmother become 75, no, 57, 75. And you ask them, how are you doing? And maybe they tell you, well, my best years are yet to come. And of course you smile and you take it quite serious, but it's posed a lot of questions, of course, by telling this. And then when you switch to the UN, you could say, okay, in terms of the life cycle of an international organization like UN, how do we have to value their age? And is there really a future for them? That's the key theme of tonight. Is there a future for the UN, and how? That's very important. But first, congratulations with, of course, this anniversary of maybe some people's favorite institution. Let's hope so. The program tonight consists of two parts. First, we connect with London and New York, and we talk with the inner circle, so to say. Two people who have been able to be here tonight from a distance. And what we'll do is ask them questions about how the UN truly works and should work maybe in the future. And the second half, after a short video, will be with somebody on the podium, André de Hoo, who's already sitting in front of you. Welcome, André. And somebody who's calling in as well, Alana O'Malley. Well, let's start, because it's me asking a couple of questions to our guests from New York and London, but soon I will switch to the audience, and you will be able also to ask your question. Okay, let's tune in with our guests from London and New York. I hear an echo, by the way. And do we have a connection with start with London? Yes, Karel van Oostrom, welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Yes, just to introduce you to the audience, you're former permanent representative to the Security Council of the UN. And just ask you a very informal question to start with. Can we read? Okay, yes, the echo is disappearing. Sorry, Mr. van Oostrom. My question to you is this one. Is it easier to strike a deal at the Security Council than a deal with the Britons on Brexit?
Thank you so much, Peter, for that question. And I think I would prefer if you would just call us Karel and Henk-Jan. It's a little bit more informal. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting us. I have to make an apology that I'm here at an all-middle panel. I made a solemn commitment not to ever again be in an all-middle panel. So technically, I will pretend I'm in the same panel as Anna, who's a good friend. It's a little bit awkward that we were three men. I apologize to everyone to whom I committed I would never do that. Second, I would like to make very clear that I'm, until last August, I was permanent representative of the King of the Netherlands, the United Nations. But since August, indeed, I'm in London, and in New York we had the first ever, again, I have to apologize for that, first ever female permanent representative of the Netherlands to the UN, Joka Brand, who couldn't be here tonight, who would be a much better person to speak to you about current issues at the moment. So I will limit myself to the past 7 years. The big difference, it's a little bit of a technical question, but if you're the Security Council as ambassador, the onus was on me. was the one doing the negotiations together with my team. We were in control together with my political bosses and our team in The Hague. The big difference with Brexit is that we are part of a much bigger process in which Michel Barnier, the negotiator now of us in the European Union, is negotiating on our behalf. So it's a completely different context, much more complicated, much bigger for our own country. I've given some interviews in the past time in which I said this time calls for diplomacy. I really believe that on the one hand in New York, if you look at the biggest issues, the way the COVID has been politicized on one hand, and on the other hand, if you look to Brexit, diplomacy. So we need young generation who believe in diplomacy and who will learn from past experiences, become experienced diplomats to solve global issues.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karel. The connection is not very good at this moment, so I hope that we can do something about it. Everybody, audience, no, we can't. How can you really follow the answers in the audience, truly? More or less? No. Well, it's a bit difficult. We will see what happens during the session, and otherwise maybe we have to disconnect at a given moment. Let's switch to our other guest from New York, Henk-Jan Brinkman, from the support office of the peace building of the UN. Welcome, Henk-Jan. You are already 31 years working for the UN. That's a long time.
Correct.
So you didn't consider this as a question. Well, let's switch to our first informal question, because you like to talk about peace building and peacekeeping. Not so long ago, the Secretary General just announced a global ceasefire immediately because of COVID. It's a bit of a difficult thing. How do you feel about that?
No, I thought it was a great initiative. I also wanted to thank you, of course, for inviting me, and very nice to be connected to Groningen, where I also spent 7 years studying economics. So it was a great initiative because there was a moment of unity, I think, in the world where certainly everybody realized we are really connected with each other. And I think even epidemiologists were surprised how quickly this virus spread actually across the world. I mean, many have predicted that we would have a pandemic at one point, but the speed and the veracity of this particular virus, I think, surprised even many experts. So there was a sense of common purpose that I think the Secretary General grabbed and made that connection to peace. Not only because peaceful countries and settings are really important to do the humanitarian and health work that needed to happen, but also because there was hopefully a sense of we need to focus on more important things and like saving our lives than only worrying about power in terms of fighting. So many responded very positively to this, both member states, civil society, think tanks, but unfortunately it didn't have the impact that we wanted it to have on the ground. There were a few cases in the Philippines and Colombia where specific fighting non-armed groups called for indeed a ceasefire and adhered to it for some time, but then it was also broken often. So there was not enough traction on the ground among the fighting partners, which of course also really needed to have engagement from mediators, from facilitators, whether that was led by the UN or otherwise.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brinkman. Well, that's also emphasizes the theme of today, that there's always a call for change, for action, for a better world from the part of the UN. And at the same time, we don't see the effects, at least not immediately. And tonight we are talking about the future of the UN. The first question I would like to ask to both of you, and it will be my question, and I hope that the audience will pick in soon, is that, okay, if we talk about the future, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is there a need to do things differently from today? Let me start with Mr. Van Oostrom. Is there a need for really do things differently than today? What's the need for change?
Peter, we agreed you would call me Carl, so that's much easier than calling me Mr. Van Oostrom.
Okay, Karel. Yes.
That's okay. So, first of all, what should stay and what should change? First of all, I think it's crucial that there's one place in the world where 193 countries talk about solving global problems. And certainly like a country like the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and we are so dependent on the world outside of our small country for economy, for our well-being, for our health. It's crucial that there's an institution where indeed we try to solve these issues at the global level. And talking is much better than fighting. So what should stay is an institution which binds together, which provides a framework for diplomacy, for trying to solve global problems. And I would like to pick up on one thing you said, that the UN just calls for ceasefire. No, I really disagree with that. In the Council, in the Security Council, but also elsewhere, the United Nations has tremendous impact, practical impact on the ground. And let me give you just 3 small examples. In India, the fact that being, if you belong to a sexual minority, being gay was punishable. There was a it was a crime. And 2 years ago, that was ended. And if you look at the verdict in which it was explained by so many UN resolutions of the General Assembly that, it's now possible to be gay in India. And with 1.3 billion people, just try to imagine how many people we talk about who can now love the person they love. The second example for me would be the vaccination issue. Polio has disappeared from most countries of the world thanks to the efforts of UNICEF, which has started an enormous vaccination campaign. And it's wonderful news because so many people in the past got polio and got tremendous problems. That has been solved. And let me give a third example. In Holland, we talk a lot about the problem of illegal migration and human smuggling. When we are in the Security Council, we got a very concrete result that human traffickers, human smugglers from Libya, who had committed horrible human rights abuses, were put on a sanction list. Their money was taken away. They couldn't travel anymore, and one of them was arrested 2 weeks ago. So what happens in the UN has impact on the ground, and certainly for a country like the Kingdom of the Netherlands, we have impact in the UN, and we changed the world a little bit for the better. What should change? I would especially argue for Security Council reform. There are now 5 permanent members, 10 elected members. The 5 permanent members reflect the reality, the global reality of 75 years ago. The 5 countries who came out as the most important powers after the Second World War: US, UK, France, Russia, and China. And that composition of permanent members does not reflect current geopolitical realities, and that's why we've been pleading for a different composition of the Council, limiting of the use of the veto, which has been extremely frustrating for many of us, certainly when Russia is blocking a tribunal for either MH17 or for mass atrocities in Syria. So limiting the veto and having bigger representation of other countries in the Council. Okay. Over to you, Henk-Jan. What do you think?
Oh, we have another moderator as well, I see. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure, first, of course, thank you for emphasizing that, of course, the UN has an impact. Then you say, okay, there should be some structural change in the Security Council. I'm curious, Henk-Jan, do you agree with that? And do you also think there's other change necessary than just this composition of the Security Council?
No, I fully agree with the assessment that the Security Council composition need to change. And when I started the UN 30 years ago, this was... oops, I got a message that the connection will end in 5 minutes, but so I don't know what the problem is. But
me too. So I'll pray if you leave in 5 minutes. This was a splendid interview.
Yeah. When I started at the UN 30 years ago, it was actually still before the Berlin Wall came down. It was the Cold War still. It was the name of the game. Europe and the US were really clearly the most important and most powerful members, and that has changed dramatically. It's both a matter of relative power and absolute power. Countries like Brazil, Egypt, China, Russia, India have become incredibly vocal and active, and seeing the UN as a platform through which they can exercise their power. And I think that is absolutely critical. That is indeed the case. I mean, the first 75 years, it was critical that the UN was important for the US. If the US did not believe in the UN, like it did with the League of Nations, where they never joined, it would have been probably even the death nail for the UN. But the next 75 years, it will be really important that emerging powers, in particular in the South, see the UN as an important platform in which they can exercise their power, but also use to address problems that are common across the world and going across borders. So I fully agree. And in 2005, actually, the Secretary General at that time, Kofi Annan, and I was working in his office at that time, tried to reform the Security Council. It had two proposals. One, both were expanding the Council from 15 to 24 members, but one proposal was introducing a number of additional permanent seats, and the other was adding non-permanent seat elected members, as Karel liked to say, but on a 6-year rotation rather than a 2-year rotation. That is the case now. Right. So that is really important. But the other thing that is really important, I think, is what the Secretary General has talked about as network multilateralism. And that really has to change as well. The UN as an actor has become less important. And it's in many settings, it's not the only actor anymore, as perhaps was the case a few decades ago. Civil society, the private sector, regional organizations, regional powers, regional entities, they have become much, much more important than they were 30 years ago, let alone 70 years ago. So we need to, and the UN has already capitalized on that, there's no doubt about it. Civil society engagement started in 1945, actually. The NGOs were present by the signing of the Charter, and actually are mentioned in the Charter. And that engagement has expanded tremendously over the years, and also with the private sector. 20 years ago, the Kofi Annan created the Global Compact to engage with the private sector and encourage them to adhere to 10 principles that involve human rights, labor rights, the environment, and anti-corruption.
Okay.
I also I have plenty of examples also where we do have an impact on the ground.
Yes, but that was not the question. Yes.
So if you want to ask me about that, I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Okay.
But maybe mention one before I do that.
Okay, one.
Because it's related also to what Karel said in terms of the vaccinations. The vaccinations program. I mean, we got rid of smallpox and we almost got rid of polio, and that just needs a little push. But that is really critical. But the number of children that die before their 5th birthday declined over the last decade and a half or so from 12 million a year to 6 million a year. And of course, that is still 6 million too many. But this is an enormous progress that is largely and can be partly attributed to the UN.
Okay, thank you very much. We see a lot on the screen here in terms of new connections that will be made. We hope we keep in touch with you. I'm just looking to the audience now. Are we still connected with London and New York? No, we are not. We try to start here. Are there any people in the room who say, okay, talking about the constellation of the Security Council and maybe the network multilateralism that is called as a new direction by Henk-Jan Brinkman. Any people who have questions on this? Because these are two very important aspects of the future of the UN. Yes, at the far end, I see Matthias.
Well, I'm personally quite surprised that the ambassador to the UK suggested that the UNSC should be reformed, since it's highly unlikely that it will ever be achieved in the first place. It's currently, I mean, of course, it's a trending issue, and it has been since the UN has been founded, really. And recently, Nigeria and South Africa restarted calls to reform the Security Council to give African members permanent seats as well. However, because of the way that the UNSC is set up, it's just impossible for it to happen. So I'm quite curious if Ambassador van Oostrom rejoins us, whether he thinks it's even possible, and to what extent he thinks it's necessary, seeing as it's highly unlikely to happen in the first place.
Yes. And I think the two gentlemen are a bit contradicting themselves, because they're talking about a new composition of the Security Council, and on the other hand there's network multilateralism. Now, well, the second thing means that the UN becomes less important, so maybe the Security Council... there you are, gentlemen.
Yeah, the American. Well, it's a very valid point you're making, Peter.
Yes.
One of the points I make in my book, Met een oranje das, a year in the Security Council. Yes. One of the points I'm making is that the moment that the Security Council is blocked, other institutions can step in, or we ourselves can make different choices. So when Russia blocks a tribunal on MH17, we built our own legal procedure in the Netherlands to prosecute those responsible for the killing of so many people. When Russia was blocking a solid investigation and attribution of the use of chemical weapons in Syria, in the Council, Russia blocked it. We moved it to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, OPCW. When Russia blocked accountability and referral of mass atrocities in Syria to a tribunal or to the International Criminal Court, we developed in a General Assembly with like-minded countries. We got a vast two-thirds majority to set up a special independent investigative mechanism to make sure that all proof of mass atrocities would be made available for legal procedures. Yes, indeed. So if the UN does not reform, it makes itself relevant, and we'll find our way elsewhere.
Okay, because you have a very nice quote in your book, so that's a little commercial for your book, with an orange tie, which is quite a nationalistic title, by the way. Why didn't you call it the blue tie? Huh?
Because everyone asks me, why are you always wearing an orange tie? And it gives me a very easy answer, saying that in the UN in New York, we talk with 193 countries, literally, and everyone must be able to recognize each other. About 25% of the diplomats change every year. Yeah. When they see my orange tie, they know, orange, that's the Netherlands.
Yes, a little Dutch promotion, I understand. Yes, but the quote that I would like to mention is this one, that we have to dance with those on the dance floor. So those who appear on dance, we have to dance with. That's an interesting question. So for the future of the UN, should we be satisfied with the people who we see on the dance floor now, or should we invite others much more actively than we do now? So what's the relevance of this quote for the future?
Yeah, so first of all, the quote is not mine, it's Prime Minister Rutte who used this to explain that It's not a matter of preference. I think that's a wrong explication of that quote. The quote is about that in international diplomacy, you have to negotiate with the leaders of other countries. So that's the key point. And we don't choose the leaders of Russia or of China or the US. That's the process in those countries themselves. So you have to. So it's a little bit naive to say, can we influence with whom we dance? We have to do business with the people who are in power in other countries, and sometimes those people are despicable. I've negotiated a lot with my colleagues of North Korea because I was chair of the North Korea committee, and the situation for the people in North Korea is horrific. It's really horrific. But you have to negotiate with the people who are in power there. There's no alternative, I believe.
Okay. Henk-Jan, you start talking about vaccines, etc. Well, we have COVID-19 now. Is there anybody in the audience who likes to ask questions of the UN connected to COVID-19? Yes, this gentleman in the front.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask because, like, we've seen how the UN made progress mainly subsequent to crisis, in a sense. Like the Second World War created it, and then you had different crises, and the UN would change its way once a crisis came. And do you think COVID-19 would be one of those crises? Like, do you think COVID-19 would be, in some sense, a moment where we can start discussing about the role of the UN and where actually they will maybe change a little bit the ways they're working?
Okay. The COVID as a blessing in disguise for the future of the UN. Henk-Jan.
No, I think that's true. Someone said, it's a shame to waste a good crisis. So that is absolutely, I think, the case. That it really puts certain issues that need to be addressed collectively through a multilateral system in really sharp focus, and that we can no longer avoid. You see that also within the UN, and the UN has always been criticized as a large bureaucracy and complicated bureaucracy and silos, which is, of course, is the case in any bureaucracy. You have silos, even in the private sector. But in a crisis, really, the UN comes together in a way that because we need to deliver. And we can deliver. We have delivered. We showed that with the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, for example, 2014, 2015, and we're delivering now. And there's one particular aspect, I think, that is really important, why the multilateral system is so important. So first of all, of course, it's the WHO plays a critical role in the sharing of information on what the state of the coronavirus is in each country's, what the latest research is in terms of how it is spread and how it can be fought. But what is, and that is more of a, the more the better together. But what is really critical, I think, is when we come to a vaccine, and that is that vaccine is really shared among the countries. That it is not just the rich countries who will get it because they have the money to pay for it, but that this is considered a global public good that needs to be equally shared, because we are still vulnerable if there is a weak link in the chain, and this is a different kind of global public good, where there will always be a weak link if not a certain number of people is vaccinated. And the scientists are not exactly clear how high that number needs to be, whether it needs to be 60, 70, 80, or 90%. And also, of course, will depend on how effective the vaccine is. So that needs to still need to be much clearer. But that there needs to be a collaboration and a multilateral understanding of how these vaccines will be distributed among countries, even countries that don't have the money to pay for them, and that we need to also negotiate jointly for what the price should be, because we saw that in the US when the federal government was largely absent, that all the states were bidding against each other to buy ventilators, for example, or PPE, the personal protective equipment, and bidding the price up. That only benefited the private sector beyond what is really reasonable.
Okay.
So I think that's a really important point.
Yes. So, but do you go this far that you say the UN will be able to guarantee equal distribution of the vaccines in this world?
Well, it's of course something that the member state will need to do. I mean, it's important to distinguish between an international civil servant like me and what the member states need to agree. So this is clearly something that the member states need to agree, and the COVAX facility that WHO created is a vehicle to do that. And of course, we can provide solutions and possible ways of addressing this. But ultimately, of course, it's the member state that negotiates. Yes. But we can propose certain criteria, and the member state could agree on how to do that.
Okay, but of course, people like us, they see countries fighting for the limited vaccines that are available. So that's really something where we are looking for a solution. But going back to the question in the audience, did you get an answer how the COVID pandemic really helps us to create a new UN role?
Well, in general, yes. Like the vaccine is one of the ways in which we can. But my question also was a little bit also like, can that be used also for a structural level of the UN, like in the institutions of the UN, if it can be, for example, you talk about now that the vaccine will be in the hands of the member states. Maybe can that be one of the reasons why they'll stray away from the member states having so much power and giving more power to the institution of the UN?
Yes. What do you think about that, Karel? That a little more power to the UN will help us to get a quicker solution on this?
That's a different question than he posed. Eh? The first question okay. I heard is it realistic at this moment to expect that structural change in the UN will result from the current COVID crisis? I'm very pessimistic. If I look at the way we handled when we were in the Security Council, Ebola crisis in Congo, where we came together and there was very quickly a resolution, and WHO was working very effectively on the ground, the same as in 2014. And I see what happened this year, where it took from the beginning of March to the beginning of July before the Security Council could come together. It's an indication that there's not enough trust among the main players in the system. So what the UN is doing, what the Secretary General has done very, very concretely is work on the vaccine with WHO, have a call for the ceasefire in conflicts, make sure that refugees at least have basic medical treatment available. Fourthly, to address the socio-economic consequences in many countries, which are tremendous. And fifthly, to help build back better in the current institutional context. For instance, reaffirming Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think is one of the things the Secretary General has done very, very poignantly, and rightfully so. But if you ask me, is the current climate a basis for a completely reform of the international system? No. I'm not that optimistic, but for a country like the Kingdom of the Netherlands, we should do our utmost to uphold that what is still there and to make sure it functions as best as it can.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there one other question on the pandemic and the UN at this moment? Otherwise, we switch to a very important topic to students and young people in this world. There is this future possibilities report, which tells that climate change is the biggest worry for people in the audience here. And the question is, okay, is this enough in the center of the UN attention at this moment, to really make us feel a little bit more comfortable than we do now?
I can maybe start. No, the answer is clearly no. We're not doing enough. There's really is an issue that I think is another example of how important social movements have become. And of course they always have had a role in history, but it's 2019 actually was a year in which we saw historic heights in the number of protests that we saw on the streets, and it was really young people foremost who brought the climate crisis really to the urgency it requires. And the UN Framework Convention has had a good agreement in 2015, probably not enough either, but the member states are not living up to the obligations and the commitments they make. It's of course also a difficult issue in terms of because the consequences are over the longer term, although it's also, of course, very clear that the consequences are here with us at this very moment. And in the United States, we have a record number of tropical hurricanes hitting the East Coast and the Mexican Gulf Coast in the south, and the fires in the west. There are very clear examples of that. But the measures we now take will take some time before they have an effect, an impact. And that is, of course, difficult for policymakers, because that might be after the next election cycle. So there needs to be a cost being borne right now to really address the climate crisis. Now, one positive note on that, I just heard an expert tell me that the impact of measures we take now does probably not take 20 to 30 years, but more like 3 to 4 years. And that is a huge change. So if we would indeed cut carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases quite drastically, which we really should, over the next few years, we could actually see already an impact of this within this decade. So that is something that would really be advantageous. But we, of course, do not have the power as a UN Secretariat to force member states to take these decisions. These are all taken at the national level and are subject to the political, economic and social circumstances in the country. Okay. The UN is used to negotiate agreements, but the implementation is, of course, limited to the member states.
But given the fact, Karel, that this is so important for many people, young people, not only Greta Thunberg and others, do we need to take this more also to the UN level than we do now? Because member states, well, they keep on fighting, yes?
It connects to the previous point, the institutional build-up. What is the UN? The UN is not just the institution in New York. The UN is, or is the member states. And probably it's both. The UN cannot exist from what the member states are doing. Yes, at the UN itself, in New York, the Secretary General himself, he's so outspoken when it comes to climate change. If you look at the programs, at the whole Sustainable Development Goals framework, it's very clear that the institution is aware of the problem and is trying to do its utmost, as Henk-Jan said. But in implementation of all the things we agreed in the past couple of years is something which has to be done by the countries themselves. And on the one hand, there are countries like Palau or Maldives, which will disappear if sea level will continue to rise. On the other, if you look at the cost of short-term costs of systemic change and transition, and if you look at the climate deniers which pop up in many countries, we as we are here together, we will not decide that the UN will govern the world, huh? So what I would call on, if you have strong political views on climate change, connect civic society in other countries. Yes. Spread the word, spread the message, and try to influence political movements in other countries, like Greta Thunberg has done.
Yes.
And let's also see what happens in elections.
Okay, thank you very much. I see people just nodding their heads in the audience. Do you want to ask a question? Yes? Okay, I thought you wouldn't agree with what the gentlemen were saying. Maybe at the far end. I see a question from Matthias on the topic of climate change and what we can do.
Yeah, I actually promised a speaker, well, I didn't promise, but I offered a speaker who joined us this Monday with SIB to ask a question regarding climate change, because on Monday we hosted a symposium on climate adaptation. And so I want to refer back to a leaked document from ExxonMobil, the largest oil company in the world, which showed an investment plan of $210 billion US, which suggested that emissions would rise by 17% by 2025. Clearly, private investment and private companies are still interested in increasing emissions, which the UN doesn't really have any power to enforce. And so one of the speakers on Monday, Dr. Sjoerd Groeskamp, suggested the North European Enclosure Dam and other similar projects to try and regionally combat the rise of sea levels. And so I would think that, in a sense, climate change could either bring us together or could break us apart. And so I was wondering if you've got any insight as to how the UN could use climate change as, let's say, an enemy to force the world to work together against it and work together to try and lower pollution and combat it as a whole, or if this would just lead to further fracturing and regionalism as the EU goes its own way, China goes its own way, and the Northern America goes its own way, to each try and combat it in their own methods. Okay. So how do you see the UN trying to unify countries against this?
Okay. Can I react to that? Is it okay, Peter?
Okay, Karel, you first, and then Henk-Jan. Yes.
First on, I'm very happy that you mentioned the issue of adaptation. Very often, if we talk about climate change, we talk about lessening emissions, which is crucial. But the negative developments are so quickly that adaptation is a crucial issue. And for that, the Dutch government has worked very intensively in the past 2 years. If you Google on Global Commission on Climate Adaptation, you will see a commission headed by Ban Ki-moon, financed for large part by the Dutch government. And by the end of January in 2021, we'll have a virtual summit, which was supposed to have taken place last month, but had to be cancelled, and it'll be virtual in January. And there we will try to provide building blocks to the COP summit in Glasgow end of next year, focusing on adaptation and what rich countries like us we can do with our own circle of influence to assist other countries. And a concrete example, in the Netherlands, we have excellent expertise on water management and building dikes and how to address the issue of the rising sea level. And we can make that technological expertise available. The other question you raised, I think we already answered, at least I answered. I don't think in the current political climate, climate change function as a rallying factor for all countries in the world. But certainly if we look at the leadership we try to have in the European Union and trying to build bridges with other countries who are aware of the issue and try to make a difference, yes, that's going to happen. But systemic change at the UN, I'm not optimistic at the current lack of trust at the global level.
Okay, let's switch to Henk-Jan, and maybe I sharpen a bit the idea. A statement could be that fighting climate change is the shortest road to peace.
So that is partly true, but we should be careful with that in not exaggerating. Conflicts have changed dramatically over the last 2 decades in their nature. We don't have wars between countries anymore, which was the most common way of war in 1945. But we have wars within states, and it's also not wars between a rebel group and the government, which was the most dominant form during the Cold War. But we have wars with many, many non-state armed actors. In Syria alone, there are more than 1,000. So negotiating a peace agreement is much more difficult. Peacekeeping has become much more difficult. And the factors that are driving these non-state armed actors has changed a lot. It's not just about power anymore. It's also about management of natural resources, including water and land. And it's also about economic gain. And sometimes the links between terrorist groups and organized crime groups and state and armed groups make it very difficult to understand exactly what their aim is. But there is indeed quite a bit of evidence that climate change is a risk multiplier. So climate change is perhaps not directly causing violent conflict, but it can really exacerbate existing conflicts over land, over water, over natural resources in general. And that is particularly playing out in dry regions of the world, the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, also the Horn of Africa, the Middle East. So yes, we do think that if there would be no climate change, there would at least be one risk taken off the scale. But it's certainly not the only risks that we have, and that is makes it much more difficult to address these violent conflicts that we still have across the world.
Okay, but the questionnaire said, okay, we are living in a fractured world, and your answer tells us that there won't be change in being fractured. It's something we have to deal with, given the nature of conflicts that we have to deal with currently. So that's not a very optimistic view, so to say, and it demands a lot from the UN.
It doesn't demand a lot from the UN. I completely agree. But we have been adapting. We have changed so much over the last decades. And this Secretary General is implementing a number of reforms that I think shows that we are even more adapting to what we are, to the changes that we see right now. The UN is not perfect, but as somebody else said, if it doesn't exist, we had to invent it. But it's hard to be so big and be perfect. There's always is some bureaucracy. As I often said, even there were silos in the Apple company, and Steve Jobs was just absolutely excellent in bringing these silos together, in particular to bring the engineers and the designers together from the very beginning, rather than having the designers, the engineers think something out and then give it to the designers and design it. And that is also something that is happening at the UN, and that certainly won't make the parallel between Steve Jobs and Antonio Guterres. Yes. But he does send a very important message to all of us as staff members, is that we need to work together and address the multiple dimensional problems that we have in a multidimensional way.
Okay, so if you're looking for a career in the UN, it becomes more and more interesting because it's so complicated that if you really would like to break your brains, go work for the UN. That's what you experienced also, Karel, I think, in your time at the Security Council. You had to run, not to go backwards, isn't it? That's one of your quotes.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic than it seems that I wouldn't have made progress if you just run. I feel very strongly that, and that's I mentioned earlier, your circle of influence. I cannot see the audience, so I feel a little bit limited that I cannot see to whom I'm talking or what you like, Peter. So if you can send me a picture later on, I would appreciate that. But focus on your circle of influence. Where can you make a difference? And it's very easy to have theories about what the world should look like or what the UN should do, but try to make a difference in your own life.
Okay, what's your message then to the people here? What do you? Yes.
That's my message. You organize yourself, be in civic society, do outreach in social media. If you believe in something, do it. Join a political party or start working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat. Look at the TV tomorrow night at 8:30 on the United Nations 75 years long, by the way. That's another advice. Read, very interesting program. Read the Telegraaf tomorrow morning with an interview with a number of people on the UN. Read my book and think where you can make a difference. I had one colleague who worked for 2 years on a resolution banning hunger as a weapon in conflict, Iran Nargan. And look what happened. We got a resolution in 2018, and 2 weeks ago the World Food Programme got the Nobel Peace Prize. And one of the 10 considerations was that it helped realize that resolution, which was a Dutch initiative. So you can make a difference, be realistic, see what you can change in your circle of influence. And then if everyone does this little bit, this world can become a little bit better.
Yes.
That's my advice.
Stay optimistic and do something yourself. Is there one question from the audience on this? Because this is your chance. Yes, the gentleman here, and then Henk-Jan, I switch to you.
It might be a little bit of a strange question, but you continue saying like work in your little sphere, work in your environment. Then what do we need the UN for, in a sense? Because if the impact is just at the local level, at the actor level, so at the states level. I understand, like, I really like the UN, but it seems like we don't really have a use for it.
Yes.
Well, first of all, what I would like to say, it strikes me that we have only male students asking questions. Are there no women in the audience?
Yes, there are. So, Peter, there are, absolutely.
So, Peter, if I could first ask you to ask one of the female colleagues there to ask a question. It begins to irritate me that it seems to be an all-male event, and I'm solid on that point.
Yes.
Then I will just stop.
That's a very straightforward Dutch approach, but I appreciate it.
Please do.
And I asked already a lady, and now she's coming. Yes.
Well, I was kind of wondering the same thing, because it seems like the UN has some sort of power on a national scale, maybe on small-scale conflicts, but then on a national scale, on an international scale, not really. Which you keep saying we should act individually, but that is a very slow process. If we with climate change, it's quite an urgent issue. So individual change takes a long time. So I think there should be some action from a supranational level. So is there anything that the UN can technically do with that? Because
no, that's a very valid point, and I fully agree with it. My message to you is make a difference yourself. At the UN, I say as a former permanent representative, it's what everyone who works there in a national capacity or working for the UN, it's what everyone tries to do. And that's why I stressed the point in the beginning that the UN has a lot of impact, real concrete impact on the ground. That's my solid point.
Okay.
But don't be naive. Don't think that the current international climate with the leadership in the US, in Russia and China will allow for a supranational organization to really become a world government. That's not going to happen. Okay. Be realistic. And meanwhile, the UN is doing its utmost, the people working there, to make a difference on the ground. And the concrete examples I gave show that is happening.
Okay, we trust, of course, the people who work for the UN, but the question is always about connecting local with global and really feel that what you're doing at a local level maybe is also helping on the international level, and what can be done globally so that I feel motivated also on a local level. Henk-Jan, to finish this off, do you have a special appeal to us next to what Karel has said?
So I do, and I agree with Karel. It is all these small steps that individuals take do add up. And it does not show that the UN is irrelevant. It's actually it shows that the UN is relevant because it has discussed these issues. And look at what Greta Thunberg, by herself, starting as a 15-year-old, has achieved. Look at Jody Williams, who started an anti-landmine campaign and got a treaty that does not allow to the use of landmines anymore. And she got the Nobel Peace Prize for that as well. Of course, I can talk about the little influence that I have had as an international staff member of the UN, just like Karel did about the influence that the Netherlands had in the Security Council. And one thing I would mention is that I spent about 5 years trying to get a goal in the SDGs on violence. That was not something that was a given. There was nothing on violence or justice or human rights or in the Millennium Development Goals. But I think because of that changing nature of conflict, because of the changes in the world, because of the preferences of people, the surveys that we have taken in the UN and asking, what is most important for you? Violence and conflict it appears always in the top 5 or top 7. So I spent a long time, and I built my own little coalition. First within the UN among like-minded civil servants, and then I just started working with other civil society groups that also were doing this, and of course member states. And of course member states ultimately took the decision on this. But there were some really important member states that believed in a goal on conflict and justice as well. And the Netherlands was one of them, but not the only one. Sweden, the UK, the US at that time. And not only the northern countries. And of course, that we really wanted to avoid the impression that this was a northern agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals are there for every country all the time. That Timor-Leste, Liberia, Kenya, South Africa, Guatemala became advocates for this was really critical to the fact that we achieved this goal. And now we have a goal 16, on creating peaceful, just and inclusive societies. And it is transforming, I think, a lot of actions at the world level. And there is at the moment a campaign of civil society with member states starting to halve the number of violent deaths by 2030. There's still about 500,000 people who die of violent deaths, and this is not in wars. That is actually only about 10%. Most of them are killed through homicide. And so this is a really extensive problem across the world. The country in which I live is one of the countries with a very high homicide rate, partly because of the prevalence of arms and guns. And so we hope that this is achieving something on the ground. But let me say one more thing. And that is where you can help yourself. The causes of war are not the same as the opposite of the causes of peace. And what is really important is that apparently the research done by psychologists is that the language is used in society. Peaceful societies have peaceful language. They don't talk about there's little hate crime. There are certainly mechanisms through which conflicts, which are inherent in all societies and all human interaction, are mitigated through mechanisms that prevent these conflicts from escalating into violence. And having commitments from the top, from the bottom, from everyday people, that we will commit ourselves to non-violent ways of settling conflicts is something that every single individual can do. And changing the language through that way and changing the way people feel about societies and create more peaceful societies is really important.
Okay. Mind your language, that's what you tell us. Thank you very much. You're optimistic, both, I think. You have
yes, I
great
get paid for that every day.
Yes, you have great examples of what the UN is achieving even today and tomorrow. So I hope this is a great message for us here in Groningen, that after 75 years, there is still a future which we can make ourselves as well. Making small steps, building coalition, choosing our own mission. So that's an optimistic message that we appreciate that you have shared with us. I thank you very much. If we have an applause here, you can't hear probably, or maybe a little bit. Yes, can you give a round of applause for our two gentlemen? Thank you very much.
Be the change you want to see. That's my last advice.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you very much, Karel. Good luck with your book. Henk-Jan, also all the best. And
Thank you so much.
Okay, see you later.
And
Thank you
good
very
luck
much.
to all of you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed it. Two gentlemen, two Dutch gentlemen, with a Dutch message every now and then. We'll have a short break now by watching a movie of one of the speakers tonight, who will be connected also digitally. And Alana O'Malley, she once spoke in Dublin at a TEDx, where she really made the connection between the individual and the global organization of the UN. Let's listen to her TEDx, and on stage will soon join me André de Hoog. Some of you will be familiar with him, to continue the program. The video.
Once upon a time, the United Nations was the epicenter for the hopes and dreams of millions of people around the world. Some sought recognition as a nation, protection of their sovereignty and human rights, and others just a general improvement in their circumstances. Both nations and people brought their problems to the UN in the belief that since it was founded to protect fundamental freedoms, it could provide solutions relevant to their everyday lives and problems. As a historian of the UN, I believe that it has many problems. But the main one is that people don't believe in it anymore. We've lost faith in internationalism, and we've lost faith in the United Nations. At the same time, we're living in an increasingly globalized world, interconnected, where the problems we face are global in scale, and our national governments seem largely unable to solve them. We need the UN more than ever. We need to reimagine what it is and what it could be. We need to rediscover its potential, and we need to find again that belief in the United Nations and its relevance for our everyday lives. If I was to ask you what you think of when you think of the UN, most people say blue helmets or peacekeepers. And indeed, Ireland has a proud record of peacekeeping with the United Nations. And peacekeeping is indeed one of the most visible functions of the UN. But it's also often associated with the darkest days of the United Nations history, such as in 1994 in Rwanda, when UN peacekeepers failed to prevent the slaughter of almost 1 million Tutsi people by their neighbours, the Hutu. As images of slaughtered men, women, and children haunted our TV screens, people vowed never again. And the UN was largely held responsible for not doing enough to save lives. So on the one hand, we often immediately associate the UN with blue helmets and with peacekeeping, but on the other hand, in the next breath, we often associate it with not doing enough when atrocities occur, such as today in Syria. The problem is that this misconception leads to an overall negative view of what the UN is and what it does. When I was 16, I was lucky enough to go to Washington, D.C. to participate in the Future World Leaders Summit, which is an international relations seminar for young people. There, I met young people from countries all around the world in which the UN is much more visible and it has a much more positive image. And there I understood that the UN is a matter of perspective. So while it doesn't have a stellar record on big, controversial political peace and security questions, it achieves huge things in the humanitarian sector. So for example, the UN World Food Programme feeds 80 million people in 76 countries around the world every day. The UN Development Programme has provided access to clean drinking water for 2.6 billion people around the world. And the World Health Organization, another UN agency, has slashed child mortality rates by 62% since 1945. So I think you would agree that these are hugely important humanitarian achievements, and they're relevant to all of us. So for example, the World Health Organization doesn't just work in poor places very far away. It's actually based in Geneva. And there, doctors and scientists lead worldwide research into infectious diseases, including one that you might be familiar with here in Ireland, which is influenza. So those doctors and scientists track the outbreak of the flu, try to predict where pandemics might occur, and advise national governments on immunization strategies and prevention programs. But even if the fear of getting the flu doesn't keep you awake at night, another area in which we clearly need the help of the UN is climate change. I think you'll agree that the summer of 2018 in Ireland has been remarkable. And we've all enjoyed the number of days without rain and the number of hours of sunshine. But it's also a sign that our climate is changing. And this change doesn't just mean we'll have more days at the beach. It means rising sea levels, less crop growth, more severe storms, and yes, even more rain than we're used to in Ireland. So, here, we don't need the UN to provide access to clean drinking water, because we have plenty of water, or access to food. But we do need the UN to tackle these big global challenges through programs like the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals is a range of targets agreed between countries to create a sustainable and substantially better world for everybody, not just the 1/6 of the world's population who live in the West. It works by encouraging countries to agree joint policies and strategies to achieve these aims in a range of areas, from climate change to the reduction of poverty to peace and security issues. Crucially, this is not some unattainable fantasy, but it's a roadmap for national governments and local municipalities to implement change to achieve these ambitions. However, it depends on people engaging with these UN-driven ideas, and it depends on people getting involved with national and local projects for change. If we do this, we can change the UN from the local level upwards. And this will allow us to change the image of the UN from being a vast, grey, elitist monolith very far away in New York to something that's dynamic and an inclusive force field that brings together global communities around these areas of progression and development and allows us to pursue collective aims together. Ireland's leadership role historically at the United Nations on peace and security issues, on human rights, and on development shows the important role that small nations and their people play in changing the UN and what it does. The United Nations Charter begins with the preamble, "We the people." We are the people of the United Nations. And from reading the archives of people all over the world, I know that the UN used to be once at the center of their lives. Not because it's populated by big men, but because it's populated by big ideas, and because ordinary people believe in the relevance of those ideas to improve their everyday lives. So the next time you get your flu jab, think UN. And the next time we're battered by a severe storm, think we need the UN. This is the moment that we need to retake control of the United Nations from the local level upwards and transform it once again into a fountain of dreams. Thank you.
Yes, another optimistic message, André, isn't it?
Let's see. Yes, it works. An optimistic message, and I support that. But I'm also a skeptic.
Yes.
And a number of questions have come by where I would give answers which are slightly different from what you may have heard. So, yes, we need to change the way the UN functions, but I'm more pessimistic about the realization of that awareness.
Let's go into depth. But before, of course, people need to know who don't know you, who you are. André, you're teaching international law at the Groningen University.
Yes, I'm more of a generalist, as we would say in Dutch. I know a lot about a lot of things in international law, but from a relatively early stage, I have been particularly studying also UN issues. Of course, from a legal perspective, which is not the same as the political or policy perspective, but it does give you a perspective which I think shows the limitation of what the UN can do.
Yes, but you're not only sitting behind your desk. I think you once participated in observing the elections in West Timor.
Yes, for those of you who might not know about the specific history of East Timor was a Portuguese colony. And Portugal was one of the colonizing powers, especially slow in accepting the independence of their colonies. And therefore they had, especially in Africa, they had some colonial wars. But in 1974, a revolutionary change occurred in Portugal. The old regime faded away. And Portugal decided that its colonies should become independent. And unfortunately for East Timor, its neighbor Indonesia was of the opinion that that would not be a good idea. So Indonesia in 1975 invaded and occupied East Timor and claimed that the people of East Timor had chosen to become part of Indonesia.
Right. Do you feel a little bit energy that also the UN should play a role in observing the US elections?
Yes. Of course, there are double standards at the UN, especially also, I would say, from the Western side, in the sense that election observers go to countries where we have doubts, but not so many election observers in countries which we think are democratic.
Okay. Who of you think, we should absolutely observe the elections in the USA? Yes. Can you ask the ladies there why they think that's very important? Yes, here in the front.
I think it's very obvious. I don't think there is a doubt that we should not do it. So I don't see the point of asking that question, really, because the US is the important power nowadays.
Yes. So they shouldn't feel afraid if they are very self-conscious. So do we need their
just to
confirmation or not? Yeah.
Well, I mean...
can we just do it?
Let me just say, of course, that there are election monitors there, but they are national election monitors, but usually from both, especially the Democrats and the Republican Party, send out, I think they call it poll watchers now on CNN. So it's not that there are no monitors monitoring the election, but we don't really send international observers there. Now, why don't we do this? Well, partially because we don't have the option. A country must be willing to accept foreign election monitors, observers, and if they don't ask for it, they're not going to go there. It's as simple as that.
Yes. So we cannot force ourselves to go there.
No. Obviously, as a private person, you can go there, and if you follow general rules about being near polling stations,
everybody is a journalist.
You can take a look, yes. But of course, you can't go in there when you don't have authorization to go in there.
Okay. Alana will be soon joining us, but you commented a little bit on the two gentlemen before you.
You want me to, or?
Yes.
Clearly, perfect examples of good Dutch diplomats trying their utmost to bring about a better world. And I think that's what certainly many diplomats from Western countries try to do. Mm-hmm. But a better world also depends on, as some of the participants have pointed out, on the architecture of the institution concerned. And that's where, there is a lot to be said.
So you say they're good diplomats, but we are the realistic people who say, wait a minute, it doesn't work the way you try to promote it.
But that's the perspective then, mm-hmm. As Alana O'Malley points out. It's the perspective, of course, which decides whether we think they're doing a good job or not.
Okay. Yes, but we are ambitious people. We are more international than our parents. So in a way, we don't want the UN to be in a kind of parallel universe, as a gentleman is pointing out here, it seems.
Indeed, but the problem is that the ambitions have grown. The architecture and the rules of the United Nations Charter were devised in 1945. Yes. And now we think that the UN should solve all kinds of problems in the world, like hunger within countries, climate change, which is,
they set their own goals, yes.
Transnational and international problem. But the UN was not devised with that in mind. In 1945, the big problems were migration within Europe and some other continents because of the war, reconstruction, which is also why the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created. But they weren't thinking specifically in terms of the problems that we have today.
Okay. And now you tell us that when the architecture is a little bit old-fashioned, so to say, or should change, can you help us a little bit? How should we rebuild? Alana's only talking about rediscover, so nothing changes, just discover. But how can we rebuild the UN?
Let me first ask a question to the participant who asked us about Security Council reform.
Yes.
Because you said in the back that it's impossible. My question to you, why do you think it's impossible?
Okay.
Well, easiest is just the veto power, and the people in the Security Council would have to agree to it. But that's not just the main issue. The main issue is that the countries which currently have veto power are incredibly powerful in the General Assembly itself. And in order for Security Council changes to happen, the different coalitions and groupings in the General Assembly would have to start the change and then continue and vote in favor of it. And with immense power that the US, China, France, the UK and Russia can throw around, it's just highly unlikely that countries would ever agree to it, because it's not really in their favor when they can get all these things from these powerful countries in order to vote against such a deal to change the UNSC. And I see Alana O'Malley is also joining us. So
yeah, she is. But I will introduce you soon. But you just tell us that, okay, talking about rebuilding the UN, this is a no-brainer because countries won't vote against their own interests. Is that shortly?
Essentially, countries will vote in their own interest because the great powers will give them things and give them concessions.
Yes,
in order
to help them
do so.
Yes. Short reactions. Now you hear why.
And yes, indeed. But there are 2 points here, politically and legally.
Yes.
So the legal point is, of course, that to enlarge the composition of the Security Council, you need to also have the ratifications of any amendment by the permanent members. So the permanent members have a veto over changes of the composition of the Security Council. That doesn't mean it's impossible per se, because there has been an expansion of the composition from 11 members to 15 members in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. So it is possible, but you need to have a very broad consensus among the memberships to get any changes through. And the permanent members in general, and that's, I think, where the political analysis lies, do not have an interest to enlarge the Security Council, because it's easier to dominate 15 members or 10 non-permanent members than it is, to dominate 15 or 20 non-permanent members.
Yes, realpolitik, as the Germans call it. Welcome, Alana O'Malley. You just were on your way to Groningen, and then you had to return because there was a big tree before your train.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got as far as Meppel, and then with just 40 minutes left to go, I got disrupted. So I had to come back to The Hague, and now here I am. So thank you so much for facilitating me, even though it's late in the discussion.
Yes, we have seen your Dublin speech at TEDx, so we know a little bit how you think. And there's a nice difference between you and the other guest on the podium, André de Hoog, who's teaching at Groningen University. And he's talking about rebuilding UN, changing the architecture. He has to still make this tangible, by the way. I will ask him soon. But you are more talking about rediscovering the UN. So what's the difference for you? It's not so much about changing the UN, but more rediscovering.
Well, I think if you look at any discussions that are classically had, and I'm talking about not just in the classroom, of course, but also in international media or in current affairs, the discussion is always about the Security Council. Can we enlarge the Security Council? What about the P5? What do we do when the P5 don't agree, etc., etc. And my whole focus is about diversifying our perspective of the UN. So trying to understand that actually the UN is much more than the Security Council. And actually the peace and security agenda is the most politically sensitive and difficult to execute successfully. So the UN's record in securing peace around the world is actually quite problematic. But actually, if you look at the other things that the UN does, which in fact tend to be far more relevant to the other 190 members, excluding the three great powers, if you like, even from the P5, then the UN has a much better record. And we know very little actually about what it does, right? So even if you look at the World Food Programme winning the Nobel Peace Prize this year, I would imagine that not many people really understood until now the extent of the work of the World Food Programme, right? So it feeds almost 17 million people around the world in 83 countries every single day. So my research is about changing the conversation about the UN to incorporate the other achievements that it has in the humanitarian sector that directly save lives. And this is not to say that everything that the UN does is great or that it's not also problematic in the other organs. But I simply think that since there's no appetite politically for reform of the Security Council right now, and that's unfortunate, but it's true, then we have to try to think differently about the rest of the UN.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're not only ignoring its achievements, we're also really making it increasingly irrelevant for people in everyday life.
Yes. We had a short discussion before you entered with the two other guests in New York and London, and it was on climate change. And, well, they maybe were a little bit more optimistic than the audience that the UN can really make a difference there. But let's switch back to André. Well, rebuilding? The UN rebuilding is not only about the Security Council, of course not. So where can we use architectural change to foster all the other goals that are very important for the reputation of the UN?
Well, this is very difficult, I must say, because the architecture is there and it is being used in a way which certainly wasn't planned in 1945. Standard setting, trying to achieve consensus on principles on how to deal with certain issues is where the UN is, of course, crucial. And this has to do with also new challenges. So, for instance, security in the cyberspace, trying to get a handle on cyber attacks, trying to get a handle on how we treat prisoners, simply within the system. So the architecture is being used in more expansive ways than was initially planned, and that's a good thing. And that's precisely, of course, what Alana O'Malley is saying, is that the UN does so much more than only peace and security through the Security Council. Now, to give you an example on why I'm a bit skeptic when it comes to the Security Council, is that we heard the mentioning of the initiative by the Secretary General on demanding ceasefires around the world because of the COVID crisis. And indeed, of course, any ceasefire is a good idea, and particularly, of course, when we're having epidemics and pandemics. Now, the Security Council has adopted a resolution on that, but has refrained from actually invoking its decision-making powers. So it has demanded a ceasefire, but in a way which shows that it's not actually making it binding on the actors concerned. And
why is that? Because, well, if you want to take action, and you have the possibility to take action, you should give it a bite, so to say.
Indeed, and they can give it a bite. They have given it a bite in the past. There were some references by our previous speakers to the Ebola crisis, for instance, in 2014-15 especially. But the Security Council is supposed to keep the peace between countries. And although epidemics may, of course, cause tensions between countries, this is not necessarily the case. So, as I understand it, Russia and others have taken the position that, yes, it is possible in specific circumstances to use the enforcement powers of the Security Council to this purpose, but that needs to be related to specific situations, not to a general, pandemic which goes around the world without any specific connection to a conflict. Now, this was the difference with the Ebola crisis of 2014-15, because the crisis was especially in a number of countries which had come relatively recently out of civil war situations, where democracies and the rule of law were still not being, properly maintained, and therefore, the disease had a destabilizing effect also in that sense.
Yes. All right, going back to Alana, are you also a bit skeptic, or do you say, okay, we can use the current pandemic to really put the UN at a higher level in everybody's mind?
I think there's two things to say here. The first one is the optimistic view, that I think is also has a greater realism element than it would have had previously, which is the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that these global crises 100% require a multilateral response. So it's not simply that it's good if there's multilateral cooperation. It really shows the reliance of states on cooperation with each other. And we need a framework of cooperation to manage that relationship. Like the United Nations, and particularly like the World Health Organization in coordinating those responses. Now, the second part of that, however, is that I think what the COVID-19 crisis also does is that it puts into very stark relevance how effective the UN is. And I think there's been a lot of criticism, quite rightly, about the length of time it took for the World Health Organization to declare a pandemic, and how this response has not been up to par in many areas. So it also creates this problem that now people realize that the UN architecture and agencies are there to help them, but they also see how difficult and problematic these agencies are in their functioning. So I think ultimately my view is that this is still an opportunity to rejuvenate multilateralism, but perhaps not just in this kind of semantic way between states making great declarations of their promises to cooperate. That's important, but it's not the only way. But now we also have a moment where individuals who may not have been interested in the UN before will suddenly pay attention, whether that's critical or not. And so it's a chance for the UN to increase its relevance. And if it can do that, particularly in this 75 moment where it's getting a bit more public attention and press and airtime than normal. If they manage to do that, then there's a possibility that we can also, transform the way that the UN works, right? Because you'll have more public attention, you'll have more local activism around UN ideas, and that really kind of relies on or points to the SDGs and their relevance. And you also have this influx of new actors, particularly young people, because they were already emerging at the UN as a kind of a group of actors that have been disenfranchised for most of the last 75 years at the international level. And they've shown how effective they can be on climate change. But now they're also going to be the ones that are most affected, or well, not maybe most affected, that's the people who really get sick and don't recover, but deeply affected in terms of employment, education opportunities, the impact on their development.
You're touching something very important, I think, that you say, okay, the UN will listen to this generation of young people in order to act. And the question is to the audience, do you have that feeling already? I just asked a couple of people that the UN is literally listening and doing something what your generation finds very important. Just go with your mic and some people that haven't talked. Yes, the chairman of the SIB.
Excuse me, what was the question?
Yes, okay. Alana is constantly making the point, also in the video that we saw, okay, there's a connection between your local vision and initiatives and ideas and what the UN is doing. And the question is, do you have that feeling how we can really improve this? Or do you have the feeling yourself that if I'm doing something, it will reach the UN?
I mean, there's always opportunities for initiatives on a local level to reach higher levels, like the UN. But I don't think it's that easy.
No.
I think everybody can make a change if they try, if they find initiatives, or with their university, with their school, or whatever. But I don't think it's that easy to make a difference on an international scale. I do think that needs to come from top down to some extent.
Yeah, that's another thing, because there are governments, there are representative bodies that act on behalf of us, and maybe they should make a bigger change that we feel stimulated. But so pointing to the individual, you should do something. Well, quite realistically, there are others who have to move.
Well, certainly, one of the points in
member states are the problem.
In the Netherlands is that we're complaining that our government is not being forceful enough in its COVID directions to us, for instance. But certainly, keep in mind that in most international organizations, it's the government that sends representatives. And of course, especially in Western countries, those governments are accountable to Parliament. So the extent to which Parliament puts pressure on the government to take certain positions and to try to, bend the policies that are being put forward by their representatives in international organizations is possible. But this is something, Parliament deals with many issues. It deals with obviously lawmaking at the national level, but they don't scrutinize the government in the same way as it does with respect to the implementation of national laws, for instance. So that could be improved.
So the UN is not a theme on the local part of the national parliamentary level?
Well, less so than, for instance, if you take the European Union, because the European Union, we know, makes binding regulations on all the EU member states. So there, at least, there will be some attention being paid to it. Whereas the UN, especially the General Assembly, can overall only make recommendations to the member states and not take any binding decisions.
That's the feeling of not being powerful enough that's constantly tonight in this room.
Yes, and this is why I said that the architecture of the UN is as planned in 1945, a time
but let's look forward.
No, of course you have to look forward, but the architecture determines what you can do. Okay. And of course they've been bending, what they can do in the direction of all kinds of problems, solving all kinds of problems which didn't exist in 1945, but the architecture limits them in what they can actually achieve in terms of binding decisions.
Alana, you will be celebrating the centennial of the UN in 25 years, I guess. So what do you think that has changed by then?
Yeah, I mean, I also just feel like I have to respond to this and say three quick things. Yes, the UN and the Dutch diplomats who are sent to the UN are answerable to the Dutch Parliament, but that's why it's important for people to get involved in UN ideas at a local level so that they have the right representatives in national parliaments to actually hold their national representatives at the UN level to some kind of accountability, right? There's no reason why we shouldn't have the debates about the UN in the Dutch Parliament that we have about the EU. In fact, if we did so, it would improve the legitimacy and the accountability of the UN overall. And secondly, I think it's really important to stress that, yes, the architecture was created in 1945, but it's not like it hasn't changed since 1945. This is not the same world that we had then. In fact, now what we have, and even since 1960, is that the UN is populated most, in terms of majority, by the Global South countries, not by the West. And they've actually changed the UN system quite a lot over time. We simply never pay attention to that because we're always just focused on the Western view of the UN and what the UN does or doesn't do for us. So I think we have to take a more global view also of the history of the UN, how it has changed. Now, what should it change in the next 25 years? I think there's a lot of momentum right now for thinking about expanding the capacity of the General Assembly. And you see this even on questions as controversial as Syria. So the whole question of creation of the humanitarian corridor for access of UN agencies to supply crucial humanitarian materials to the Syrian conflict, that question was deadlocked at the Security Council, so it got sent to the General Assembly. So you see this recourse to the General Assembly a little bit more. Yes, the resolutions are non-binding, but anything that gets passed in the General Assembly, it's worth remembering, needs to have a huge majority. So there's a huge amount of lobbying and political kind of horse trading that goes along behind the scenes in the General Assembly that's actually, firstly, much more representative and incredibly very, very difficult to get anything done. So even though the final text isn't binding, the deals that are made to get to that point often are between the individual nations. So that's what I'm saying, is that we need to, if we change the conversation for the next 10 years about the Security Council, we'll have a much better understanding of the relevance of the other political organs. Okay. So in 25 years, I want to see a female Secretary General. I think that has to be the next thing the UN does. I think in terms of statement and purpose, in terms of modernity, that would be an excellent move. Okay. But that's very ambitious, right? So I don't. And
you say pay attention to the process that the UN is really stimulating of all these lobbying and negotiations between all the member states. That's a very important thing. I see a question from the audience. The gentleman in the middle.
Yeah, so since we're talking about the future of the United Nations, I was just thinking, is the United Nations the right name for this organization in the future? Because right now we are organized in nations, that is the basic structure, but I think a lot of, the things raised by Olana are, we should, as individuals, participate, use our own influence. So then, should it maybe be called United Humanity and less from the perspective of the nations? So yeah,
what's in the name? So make it a kind of a government thing. That's interesting. Change the name. First, André, and then Alana, maybe.
Maybe to respond to something I believe Alana said, whether in the TEDx or here, the UN Charter starts with "we the peoples."
Yes, already. So that's why.
Except that the peoples, after that first mention, don't really show up in the UN. It's government sending representatives, to the General Assembly, to the Security Council. So. The "we the peoples," of course, was an American desire, because that's how their constitution starts, "we the people," and therefore they wanted to have a similar kind of democratic ideal, starting the text of the charter, you might say. The charter, of course, as a 1945 document, doesn't really mention individuals.
Do you like to change the focus that this gentleman is?
Well, let me put it in different terms. If you take the big picture is, and I'm being very cynical now. The big picture is not the people dying of COVID. The big picture is, will humanity survive? Whether through whether there is a threat of nuclear war, whether it's a pandemic which wipes out everybody instead of just a small percentage of the people getting it, whether an asteroid will destroy the Earth.
Oh,
that's the big picture. So if you want to change it, into the United Humanity Organization, that certainly makes sense. It's humanity, the species that we want to survive. Of course, all of us individually also want to survive. So it has to be a kind of balance between what is in the public interest and what is in the individual interest. But what's in a name? In the end, the United Nations were those countries working together in the Second World War to defeat the Axis powers. And that kind of stuck. Of course, it's based on the Declaration of the United Nations of 1942.
Maybe it becomes more democratic. What do you think about this, Alana? United humanity, united people, well, this type of different naming?
I think that the member states will have a massive problem with that since they pay for the UN. But I think that the premise of the question is very good. How do we, if we were to make one fundamental change to the UN, what would it be? And I think that this is a massive issue that the UN faces. This, firstly, totally misconceived organization, right? So nobody really understands what completely happens through the UN system. Secondly, it has this very negative image of something that's grey and bureaucratic and very far away and not very relevant, not very interesting, not very modern, not very representative. And I think then that thirdly, you are going to have this clamoring between these newer actors and NGOs, civil society, youth groups and women, underrepresented minorities at the UN, indigenous communities, who see the UN as something that they can use as a useful platform for their political causes. And so I think the diversity of the players within the UN system will certainly expand in the next 25 years. And then the word nations becomes interesting because it's not called the United States because we have one of those, but also because it's nations, right? And nations are not necessarily states. And that keeps with this emphasis on peoples in the title. Now, it's true that, as the other commentator has mentioned, that the rest of the Charter kind of, if you like, crystallizes that idea of state sovereignty being the absolute principle. But I do think that that's key, that word nations. So I suppose for me, the change would be in the first part, united or not. Okay. And that really changes issue to issue.
Okay, well, it sounds like a compliment for your question. You touched something that's very important. One next step could be talking about network multilateralism. Should we change maybe also the influence other people can have at UN level? So it's nation, no, but member states, interesting, yes. But we have imported NGOs, we have others, and why don't they sit at the table? Visibly for us.
Partially simply because states don't want them to sit at the table, as much as could be the case.
No, other people may not want, but they do.
Well, partially, I will say this. NGOs perform a very useful function, but they have a one-track mind. They only have their purpose.
Any objection in the room from this?
No. So if you have a human rights NGO, it only thinks of human rights and not of the broader picture. Okay. If you think in terms of the environment, you only think of the environment. Politics is, of course, about balancing. And in that sense, with this one-track mind, they represent some of the people, but not necessarily all of the people. We can think it's a good goal they're striving for, but that doesn't mean everybody agrees on what specific measures must be taken.
Let me check with Alana. Do you agree with this? That this one-issue mind of NGOs really hinders solutions, or can it just help to create solutions?
I think NGOs are very strong advocates for their causes. The problem is that perhaps I mean, I wouldn't go as far as one-track mind, but they can be single-issue NGOs, and there are many, many issues to be dealt with. So on the one hand, I think NGOs are essential, not just in providing impetus into what the UN discusses, but also in helping to execute UN ideas in a very loose sense, right? So being there on the ground, providing local intelligence. But the other big constituency of actors that I think has to be a stronger part of the UN, and it's very problematic, is private companies and industry, essentially, because and oftentimes these companies, they're richer than a lot of the states who are UN members, and they have a huge capacity to act, both positively and negatively. So I think what we will see is a greater embrace, a closer relationship between the UN and private actors. And the Global Compact really started that process 20 years ago. But I think we're going to see a greater role for them, particularly as we try to solve the COVID crisis, because the vaccine, of course, will not be a public good for a long time, but also distribution will be incredibly difficult and yet incredibly important. So I think they will be a very important actor going forward.
Yes. Well, I don't think, André, that Facebook needs the UN.
Of course, there is a company called ICANN, which regulates the internet. Facebook at least needs ICANN. Now, of course, because of the major impact that particular company has, which is located in the United States, there have been, of course, calls to maybe kind of internationalize that company, to put it under international control. The problem being is, of course, that if you put it under international control, you make an international organization responsible, that certain countries also get an influence which we might not appreciate having that kind of influence. So the fact that it's a US company and in principle therefore subject to control of the US lawmakers is possibly preferable to actually internationalizing the whole issue. Now, of course, we do have other international organizations which have an impact on that. The International Telecommunications Union, for instance, is the policy-making organization, also with respect to the internet, I think, not only, but also.
Okay, let's see. In the audience, are people optimistic about private organizations getting involved in decision-making at the UN? Because that's more or less what I hear. Can you come up with the microphone? Yeah, you stand there and ask the people here in front. You're right in front of me. Yes. You too, yes. Thank you for being here. How do you feel about private companies getting more involved in the UN?
Well, if private companies do start getting involved in the UN to a greater degree, that would, in a positive way, then the impact that they could have would be quite immense.
Yes, but they have big lobby power, for example. So how do you take care of a balanced way of decision making if there's a strong lobby in one direction instead of others?
Well, I think maybe through the use of, and this is very futuristic, I guess, but maybe through the use of social media and more social protests and all that help regulate how much power private companies will have on the international level.
Oh, that's interesting, because currently companies are using social media in their own interest, but you say it can be the other way around in the future. If we organize social media better than today. That's interesting. Making the UN more democratic by also listening to a well-organized social media forum.
One of the difficulties is who are you going to invite? I mean, with states, it's relatively clear-cut. There's a couple of states we're not asking in, either because we say they're not states or because we don't like them. Taiwan.
This is about direct influence.
No, but that's precisely my point. The whole point about having an international organization is who is in the club and who is not in it. Now, it is possible to think of democratizing the UN, but one of the points that I can make is that the Sustainable Development Goals are seen as a means to improve matters at the national level, but there's no question of actually applying it at the international level. So democratizing international organizations is not something being considered by states at all. So this is one of the problems. NGOs have a relationship, especially with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, but they are not invited to other organs of the United Nations. They are, of course, with the specialized agencies, such as the World Health Organization. I noticed that the World Health Organization just created a foundation allowing for general donations to be made to the budget of the WHO instead of focused donations for specific projects. So that, of course, is an interesting mechanism, because once you kind of detach financing from the individual contributions of the member states, you allow for more independent space of action.
That's more our way of thinking, I guess.
Yes, I mean, you know, who in the Netherlands we have this saying, you know, who pays, who determines. Mm-hmm. So if you pay, there will be a certain impact also on what kind of decisions are made and what kind of policies are set. So democratizing the financing of international organizations might be an interesting venue.
Yes, thank you very much.
Avenue.
What do you think about it, Alana?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's worth bearing in mind that the UN is grossly underfinanced as it is now, right? And that's a very problematic situation, given that its work expands every year, but the amount of money that it has to do that work doesn't increase. So certainly we need to find other mechanisms to fund the UN. And it's worth also bearing in mind that I'm talking about the UN Secretariat in New York and those agencies. But if you look at the IMF and the World Bank, well, they don't have the same problem with funding with contributions. So the question becomes, and they're still agencies within the UN family. So the question becomes, why is there this disparity? The problem is that if we start to accept large-scale donations from corporations, there is certainly the prospect of a misappropriation or undue influence of certain companies. But at the same time, a company such as, you know, Microsoft or Apple, I mean, they have such enormous resources at their disposal that actually the other argument is that rather than them giving it to one charity of their choice, isn't it not better to put it into the UN system to strengthen the multilateral humanitarian institutions and architecture that we already have? If we can find a way to manage that finance with the tremendous oversight, which is something that we don't do with the IMF and the World Bank. So we just kind of accept that they dole out their money as they see fit. And there isn't a tremendous amount of oversight into how the internal financing operates. So that's not the best model, but at the same time, we need to think of creative ways to increase financial contributions, because on the one hand, you can ask the member states for more, and some countries will increase their contribution, but most of them won't, and most of them can't. So in the next 25 years, to go back to your earlier question, I think we're going to see a greater stepping up to the plate of some corporations who are more willing to, you know, apply their enormous profits through the UN system. Hopefully.
Thank you. Yes. Let me just check, future generation. Are you willing to pay a UN tax in the future? Who says, yes, I will, no problem. I believe in the UN. Yeah, there's one gentleman at the back, and maybe you too. And you too.
I would add that.
Yes, a UN tax. Why? You're a man, but you're a human. That's tonight, so that's important. Men or women, humans. Yes.
Well, I have to say that I would be willing to pay a UN tax if I actually feel that my interests are represented. The same way I
no taxation without
exactly like I would be happy to pay a European Union tax right now because I feel represented in the European Union. But as the UN is right now, I think there is simply not enough, or it might be the perception of the media, but there's not simply enough representation for me to actually do.
But in the future. You will, and you're already willing to pay it now, or not?
Yes, even now,
yes.
I would be willing to pay.
Because?
Well, for one thing, because in the end, the United Nations is crucial for progress in the world.
In the end, already now.
Well, now and in the end, of course, a lot needs to be done. But so, as various speakers have pointed out, many important developments have been instigated or implemented by the United Nations. So, obviously, one of the problems within the UN is that, the membership does not only consist of democratic states, and therefore our interest as more cosmopolitan liberal thinkers might not be assured. But at the same time, many of the activities which are being done on the ground are crucial for many people. So I'm certainly willing to contribute. Okay. Of course, keep in mind we're talking taxes here, but of course you can always make voluntary donations.
No, but everybody feels this kind of obligation. How do you think about this, Elena? Is there something worthwhile to continue discussing, the UN tax?
I think a lot of people freeze up when they hear the words more tax. So I think we probably have to find better language about it.
Ireland is also a tax paradise, isn't it? Yes, that's right.
Yeah. But I mean, I think, before we start talking about asking individuals to pay a tax to the UN, because you can already donate to some of the agencies. So if you want to be a good UN citizen, you can do it yourself. But I think before we do that, we really also have to talk about what happens to the enormous tax breaks that multinational corporations enjoy now. I mean, there's absolutely zero overview in really certainly through the UN system, but also I think outside it, of how the current donation system is managed. And this is even where the UN works hand in hand with some companies through the Global Compact. So I think perhaps it might be better if we had a kind of really thought out proposal passed majority by the General Assembly to think about encouraging some of the, as I said, the major multinational corporations to donate some of their profits on a yearly basis to the UN. And we had something like this in the 1960s when the UN General Assembly passed resolutions regarding the control of activities of multinational corporations in their territories. And that was really about access to resources. And of course, it led to the Declaration of Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Resources in 1962. And this led to a whole discussion in the General Assembly about what the role of the Assembly should be in controlling the access to natural resources of companies operating in state territories. And that was really about, certainly about Africa and about kind of sovereignty over resources.
Interesting.
But we can make that argument now about sovereignty over profit, if you like. And I think that would be a really, really interesting debate that would really also draw people into the UN, because it would kind of take this kind of autonomous agency of these corporations right now and really bring them more into public accountability under humanitarian guise.
Okay, thank you very much. Final round of questions to the audience. Any people in the audience who say, okay, I have a question to Andre or Alana on the future of the UN? Well, we're going to wind up the discussion. Andre, you've experienced the whole evening. There's the first two speakers, questions from the audience, Alana with her expertise. What's your impression about the future? Should we sit back and relax?
No, definitely not. I heard one of the previous speakers say that climate change, if climate change were to be dealt with effectively, then we were en route to peace. Yes. I don't think so. Clearly, climate change is an important problem that we have to deal with, but there wasn't any peace before we really became aware of climate change, and there won't necessarily be peace afterwards. It's people who make peace, and these problems contribute to the tensions, but they are certainly not the cause per se of the tensions. Humans are not a particularly peaceful species, let's just face it. So He did mention later on that climate change is
Multiplier or something.
a threat multiplier, and that can certainly be true for specific situations. But it's not the cause of all the trouble we have in maintaining peace in the world. So
that's the message to the audience. You may think that climate change is the most important, should be the most important priority of the UN, but don't be mistaken.
No, I think, you know, just because it is a problem doesn't mean it's the only problem, and it's not even.
No, it's about prioritizing, huh?
No, I think the comment about languages, you know, which are peaceful, you know, also show more peaceful societies. That kind of goes more to the problems we have as a species, I think.
Okay, that's why we can start at the bar, if it's possible to enter the bar, of course, these days, but just take care of what you say. What's your message, Alana, for the young people there? You have many students also in The Hague and Leiden. We're here in Groningen. Yeah. Slightly different kind of people, but most of the same. What's the message?
Yes. I think the message is clear, that the fact that we're having this discussion tonight, and there are many UN 75 events taking place, not just in The Hague, but around the world. And on Saturday, we'll have our very small event in the Peace Palace to mark the anniversary. So the message is clear that I think youth are interested in the UN. And it's not just because of climate. It's also, I think, because of their collective futures, really. They see them now hanging in the balance. And a lot of the guarantees that even my generation had are no longer safe. So the answer is really to, again, go back to the UN, think about new ways to understand it, its history and its power and its problems, and then try to think of creative solutions. And I think a lot of what the activism that we've seen already from young people with the school strikes, the Fridays for Future campaign, a lot of their kind of interest in international affairs. I mean, this is blossoming. This is a really important and interesting moment. So it's not really about celebrating how great the UN is at 75 or thinking about if we'll ever have international peace. I agree. I don't think we'll ever have international peace everywhere. But it's about what can we change now for the next 25 years so that when we come to UN at 100, have we improved the situation for most people in the world? And since that most people in the world by then will be, the population will be far younger than it is now globally, then we really have to take seriously the role of young people at the UN and encourage them to continue this conversation after tonight and after the UN 75th anniversary, and really try to think about the SDGs and their personal choices around those questions and their kind of interest in advocating for ideas and being active among their communities and their friends around this UN agenda, because it's not going anywhere. And unfortunately, as we do know, the climate crisis, for one example, is getting worse, and COVID-19 seems to be getting worse. So the answer is only to take responsibility upon ourselves to do something, rather than waiting for the states to save us.
Okay, we should not lower our expectation on the UN. We should just increase our own energy and initiative and discussion. So I hope you enjoyed tonight. And if you were a bit skeptic maybe on the UN, maybe after this celebration of 75 years, you could say, well, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that's one of the most important things we could achieve tonight. Thank you very much, André. Thank you very much, Alana, for joining us. And I wish you a good evening and a good future for all of you. Thank you very much. And applause for you both.